Hello, this is a presentation of Case 12-29 for MBA 691, Managerial Accounting for Decision-Making, Planning, and Control by Nick DeLucy and Josh Elder. This problem is about the Scotty Sweater Company. The Scotty Sweater Company produces sweaters under the Scotty label. The company buys raw wool and processes it into wool yarn from which the sweaters are woven. Previously, all of the wool yarn that was produced from raw wool was used in the making of sweaters. Recently, however, a new market has emerged for the wool yarn itself. The yarn is purchased by other companies who make various goods such as blankets, sweaters, and hats. This new market has given rise to a debate at the Scotty Sweater Company as to whether the company should start selling the wool yarn itself or continue processing it into sweaters. Various data was collected from the Scotty Sweater Company to help give a more clear picture of the debate. Displayed here is the revenue and cost of processing the wool into sweaters. The selling price of $30 was recently reduced from $40 due to unusually warm weather in the areas that the sweaters are sold. Looking at the data, we can see that the sweaters currently are being sold at a $2.50 manufacturing profit loss due to this decrease in selling price. The data displayed here shows the revenue and costs of processing the raw wool into wool yarn. One spindle is enough to make one sweater. The selling price for a spindle of yarn is $10 cheaper than that of the current selling price of the sweaters. Furthermore, the manufacturing profit for one spindle of yarn stands at a gain of $4, a 260% increase over the manufacturing loss of the sweaters. This fact has only increased the debate at the Scotty Sweater Company. The sales manager is upset that the company is selling the sweaters at a loss when it could be selling the yarn at a profit. This brings us to the questions at hand. The first question posed by this problem is, should the company sell the wool yarn outright, or should it continue to process it into sweaters? This question is calling for a sell or further process analysis, where we take a look at the relevant and irrelevant costs and benefits to determine which is a better choice for the company. The second question is asking for the lowest price the company should accept for a sweater if it decides to continue to produce them. For this question, we will be looking at the opportunity cost of producing the sweaters and how that affects selling price. First, we will take a look at the solution for question number 1. In order to answer the first question, we must determine the relevant costs. When looking at which costs are relevant and which costs are not, we must analyze which are avoidable. In the case of making sweaters, the avoidable costs are the raw materials specifically used to make the sweaters and the direct labor that goes into making the sweaters. These costs would be the ones avoided if the company decides to discontinue the sweaters and sell the yarn wool outright. The avoidable costs in this case are the wool yarn and the manufacturing overhead. The wool yarn is an unavoidable cost because it is a joint product cost. This is because the cost of manufacturing the wool yarn is shared by both products and thus will be incurred regardless of what the company chooses to sell. It is shared by both products because it occurs before the split-off point. The manufacturing overhead cost is unavoidable because it is a sunk cost. It too incurs before the split-off point. It is a sunk cost because the manufacturing overhead costs for the Scotty Sweater Company are fixed and will not be affected if the sweaters are discontinued. The avoidable costs in this case are the relevant costs in a problem like this because they are the ones that will differ in total between the two alternatives. These will be the costs that we will focus on moving forward. After determining the costs, we must now calculate the incremental revenue from further processing the wool yarn into sweaters. The incremental revenue is a relevant benefit of further processing because it is the benefit that differs in total between the two alternatives. To do this, we took the final sales value of the sweaters on a per sweater basis and subtracted from it the sales value of a spindle of yarn. This gave us an incremental revenue of $10. Next, we determined the total incremental cost of further processing. These costs are the same as the relevant cost determined earlier. They include the buttons, thread, and lining that goes into the sweaters, as well as the direct labor used to create the sweaters. Adding these two together gave us a total incremental cost of $7.80. As mentioned earlier, we are ignoring the material cost and direct labor cost of the wool yarn because they are irrelevant due to the fact that they are a joint product cost. The final step to determine whether or not the company should process the yarn further or sell it outright is to determine the additional contribution margin created by further processing. We did this by taking the incremental revenue from further processing that we calculated earlier and subtracted from it the incremental cost calculated earlier. This gave us an additional contribution margin of $2.20. This means that the further processing of the yarn into sweaters will add $2.20 to the contribution margin of the company per sweater. This is a positive result and indicates that the company should continue processing the yarn into sweaters. Now, we will take a look at question number 2. When determining the solution for this question, the most important factor to look at is the opportunity cost of making a sweater over selling the yarn. An opportunity cost is the potential benefit that is given up when one alternative in a decision is selected over another. In this case, the selling price of the wool yarn is the potential benefit given up when deciding to further process the yarn into sweaters. The opportunity cost is an important factor in solving this problem because it will be used to directly compute the minimum selling price. In order to determine the minimum acceptable selling price for a sweater, we took the opportunity cost mentioned, which was the selling price of the yarn at $20 a spindle, and added it to the additional variable cost of making a sweater. This gave us a minimum selling price of $27.80. The price is the minimum acceptable price because it is the lowest the company can sell the sweaters at before the additional contribution margin created by the sweaters becomes less than that would be created by selling the spindles of yarn outright. This is a good sign for the company because even at unusual slumps in the market, such as the one the company is facing right now due to the unusually warm weather, it appears that the sweaters will sell at a price that is higher than this minimum price. If the company is able to bring the selling price back up to $40 a sweater, it will only be sitting in an even better position. In conclusion, we have decided to recommend that the company continues to further process the yarn into sweaters. This is because the incremental revenue of processing the yarn into sweaters exceeds the incremental processing costs incurred after the split-off point. This means that the further processing of sweaters will be profitable to the company. We also determined that the minimum acceptable selling price for a sweater is $27.80. This price must be maintained. If the company is unable to sell a sweater at or above this price, then it should start thinking about selling the wool yarn outright. From this problem, we learned how to work through the sell or process further decision-making process. We also learned about relevant costs and how they affect this decision, as well as joint product cost and sunk costs and their role in the decision-making process. Lastly, we learned what an opportunity cost is and how that affects the minimum selling price of a product created after a split-off point in a process versus selling the product created before the split-off point. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed and learned something new.